The world's come to expect great things from UC Davis. The bold, the daring, the big ideas that do more than address today. They solve for tomorrow. Because we've never viewed better as before and after. Systems are ever evolving, and instead of letting them evolve around us, we change with them and lead the charge. We invite you to lead with us, answering the questions the world has yet to ask, educating the students who dream of a brighter, healthier, and more just tomorrow, shaping the course of what's happening to what can and should be. We keep the big picture in frame with a clear understanding of every detail. Bringing that image into focus, it takes a different way of thinking. A different way of looking at the world. It takes a fresh point of view beyond a single vision. The kinds of collaborations that advance what's healthy, humane, and right. The kind of approaches that push the edges of unconventional. The kinds of solutions that reframe what's possible. The kinds of leaders that reveal a new way forward. Big ideas that seem unimaginable at the start simply need the time and space to grow. To uproot injustice, to remove barriers, to break through. And to do it all over again, better. When the world calls on UC Davis, it expects great things. With your help, we can show the world it should expect even greater. Expect greater from UC Davis for the world.
Hello everyone, I'm Chancellor Gary May. I'm so glad you could join us for part one of this special two-part plugged-in event focusing on sustaining healthier communities. At UC Davis, we're deeply committed to reversing climate change, uprooting social injustice, and removing the barriers that stand between us and a greater future. Today, we'll discuss one effect of climate change that we in California are all too familiar with: wildfires. Fires have long been a natural part of the forest regenerative process. However, after years of global climate change and droughts, wildfires have increased in both frequency and intensity. Today's discussion will focus on living with the threat of wildfires. Our moderator, Dr. Meji Abu-Najm, will guide our expert panel through a discussion of recent wildfires and their impacts. They'll discuss impacts on communities and human health, and impacts on our natural resources and the health of our forests. At UC Davis, our holistic approach to finding answers to the world's most pressing questions pushes the boundaries of what's possible. How can we reimagine our forests to be healthier and more effective in helping us address climate change? And how can we mitigate the effects of air pollution that disproportionately impact vulnerable populations? A diverse group of change makers at UC Davis, including members of today's panel, is meeting this challenge head-on. The ultimate goal is to sustain healthier communities for the long term. But what exactly does it mean to sustain healthier communities? It means we're raising the bar for well-being by pursuing solutions that nourish communities and give people equitable access to the resources they need to thrive. We do this in a number of ways: by addressing violence, pollution, homelessness, and more. Unchecked wildfires are a very real threat to our region and our health. I'm so grateful that right here at UC Davis, we have some of the world's top experts tackling this problem head-on. I hope you find today's discussion both inspiring and informative.
Thank you, Chancellor May, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for part one of our special two-part plugged-in event on sustaining healthier communities. I'm Majdi Abu Najm, a faculty at the Department of Land, Air and Water Resources at UC Davis, and I will be moderating today's talk. The university wanted to host these plugged-in events for you, the supporters of UC Davis, so we could stay connected during these times of social distancing, and so we could keep you appraised of the many exciting things happening at UC Davis. Before I quickly introduce the topic and the amazing panel we have today, I would like to send this message of love and support to all the communities impacted by fire. As a believer that photos are worth 1,000 words, I'm thankful to my Paradisian friend, Alan Meyer, who shared with me those pictures that echo the story of Paradise and the hopes of a strong community that rose above the ashes of Camp Fire to reimagine a sustainable future that embraces resilience, low-carbon living, and a fully integration with nature. The magnitude of loss and devastation destroyed the physical infrastructure of Paradise, but with a strong sense of community, Paradisian quickly regrouped and started the process of reweaving their social fabric, and I'm humbled to be a very small part of this reimagination journey. As Chancellor May said, fires are part of the land regenerative process. Years of separation between natural and human systems, coupled with global climate change, drought, insect infestations, and policies, all have led to increased frequencies of big and uncontrollable wildfires. Today, we want to discuss the impact of the recent big wildfires on communities, on our health, on natural resources, on diversity, and on the health of the forest. We ask ourselves, how can we restore the balance and reimagine our forests healthier and more capable of regeneration and more effective in sequestering carbon and addressing the global climate change challenge? We have an exceptional panel of experts who will shed light on a wide range of those effects and reflect on what can be done. Professor Andrew Latimer will provide an overview of the current state of health in our forests and rangeland and share his expertise as the faculty director of the UC Davis Natural Reserve Systems. Professor Beth Rose Middleton will help us explore indigenous practices and tap on the centuries-old wisdom of the land's early stewards to revive old practices like prescribed fires. Professor Helene Margolis would talk about effects of health and air pollution on vulnerable population. And last but not least, Professor Jay Lund will share his thoughts about fire and will be ready to discuss the impacts of the latest on drought and on forest health, soil moisture loss, tree mortality, and fuel accumulation. After all the panelists have had the opportunity to speak, I will open it up for Q&A session. For those of you who have already submitted your questions before the webinar, thank you. If you have not yet submitted a question, don't worry. You will have the opportunity to do so throughout the event. Just type your question in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for a particular panelist, please be sure to mention their name in your question. Lastly, after the Q&A, there will be a short poll that we would like you to fill, which will give us insights into topics that interest you and help us plan for future events. With that, let's get started. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Latimer, Professor of Plant Sciences.
Hello, and thanks for being here, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to present some thoughts about where we are with wildfire in California, and to give you some research ideas about directions we might take to improve our relationship with fire. So where are we now? Well, where we are now depends on where we've been in the last several decades. And in the second part of the 20th century, in the early 21st, where we've been is mainly trying to suppress fire. California society's relationship with fire has been mainly to try to squeeze it out of ecosystems for a lot of good reasons, including smoke exposure and risk and damage to timber and recreation areas. But this has led in many areas to a buildup of fuels, and the result is that despite a really high level of investment in firefighting, up to over $1 billion a year now, and the loss of many firefighter lives in fighting fires, fires are nonetheless escaping our containment. Fires have burst out from the ring we put around them and I'll show on this slide just a few fires that we can reach pretty close to Davis. And some of these fires have started to burn under the really extreme conditions that we're seeing lately with warmer temperatures, more intense droughts, and the higher fuel loads that have resulted from lack of fire. One of the things that really became, I think, very glaringly clear in 2020, and though I've been working with fire as a fire ecologist for 20 years now, it actually is still surprising to me how intensely fire is related to so many parts of our lives. And so the fires of 2020, for example, showed us that the way we manage lands, including our forests, rangelands, grasslands, can affect many people, including people working in the fields in the Central Valley, growing our food. And then the amount of damage a fire causes is also related to our housing policy and where we build structures, or the ability of people to build denser neighborhoods within cities or whether we sprawl outwards. In any case, fire is really an essential part of California ecosystems. It's really not possible to understand how these ecosystems work, or to look at them and really understand why they are. Why do we have this clump of trees, these shrubs, these kinds of grasses? Well, a lot of it has to do with fire and the role that fire plays in the ecosystem. And whether we like it or not, fire is here to stay, because in California, we have the kind of climate that generates a fair amount of plant productivity, the super high plant diversity that we're blessed with in this state, and also contains every year a really long dry period during which fires can spread. So we need to live with fire. And what can we do to improve our relationship with it? Well, you'll hear from several people here in this session about various ways that we can improve our relationship with fire, including empowering local communities, building on traditional indigenous knowledge of fire, as well as potentially changing building codes, building more fire-safe houses. The thing that I'd like to talk about here for a minute is what we can do to restore areas that have been affected by fire, to produce healthy and resilient landscapes. And one of the projects that people in my lab are involved in is using drones to survey large areas and map all of the trees that survive after a fire. And why this is valuable is that it allows us to predict where trees are going to come up and do well, so that agencies like the State Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service, BLM, other federal agencies, can use their scarce tree replanting resources as effectively as possible in only the areas that need it. Another key question is, if we're going to replant trees in forested areas, what kinds of trees do we plant and how do we plant them? And there's increasing evidence that planting large areas of monocultures of dense pines is really a bad idea, partly because it's flammable and also because it's susceptible to bark beetle attack. We've done some large-scale surveys, again using drones, to map where beetles are spreading, and we find that it really matters to beetle spread how diverse the forest is. If you've really got a lot of concentrated ponderosa pines in a plantation, beetles will rip right through that and kill off many of the trees, as happened across a lot of the Sierras in 2012 to 2016, fueling some of the subsequent fires. So instead, it makes sense to plant a diversity of trees, and exactly how is really one of the focal points of our research. And one example of this is that we're working with some groups who are replanting oak woodlands near Paradise in areas affected by the Camp Fire. And we're also working with the Forest Service to measure different planting methods that they use to figure out which ones work best. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to talking to you further. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Beth Rose Middleton, who is professor and department chair of the Native American Studies Department.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's an honor to be able to speak on this important topic. I'm speaking here from Patwin Wintun Homelands in Davis, and honored to be able to speak about cultural burning and the importance of Indigenous leadership in landscape restoration. Cultural burning is particularly important in the context in which we live and work, where climate change is resulting in increasing temperature, increasing aridity or dryness, and increasing drought throughout the Southwest, and increasing risk of catastrophic fire. This is largely due to the legacy of fire suppression and attempted removal of indigenous peoples from California and throughout the region. That suppression had significant negative human and ecological outcomes. Conversely, traditional knowledge of landscape stewardship as applied in native-led restoration activities, including cultural burning, has multiple co-benefits for ecosystem health, for local employment, for empowerment of communities, and addressing a very painful history of oppression and exclusion, as articulated in Governor Newsom's Executive Order N-1519, which establishes the Truth and Healing Council. In my role as a faculty member in Native American Studies at UC Davis, I am involved in both learning about cultural burning in practice on the land, as well as helping to educate current and future resource managers on the importance of cultural burning and the importance of building respectful collaborations with indigenous nations and communities, and finding funding to support collaborative native-led restoration. And as part of that, facilitating land access for indigenous people to be able to apply these techniques. There is a great deal of academic and practitioner science emerging about the effectiveness of cultural burning for its multiple benefits, increasing habitat, raising the water table, improving overall ecosystem health, and reducing the risk of catastrophic fire. I've listed a few resources here from Professor Don Hankins, Dr. Frank Lake, Dr. Jonathan Long, and many others. And on the right, you'll see two photos shared with me by North Fork Mono Chairman Ron Good that show some of the results of his work working to restore meadows in the Sierra National Forest using cultural burning as one of the important techniques of restoration. These are some images of one of our Keepers of the Flame workshops. These are UC Davis students directed by Chairman Good over in the background on the left side. We are learning here about how to coppice or cut back traditionally important plants, sourberry and redbud, and then how to prepare the material for a burn. Light the burn. As you can see, it burns in an exact circle, and we discuss here the benefits of the ash in the soil and the smoke on the standing trees there. And then we mix in the ash into the soil. Cultural burning has several characteristics that are important to point out. First, it tends to be site-specific, low intensity and repetitive. It's a repeated practice that takes place on the landscape. It's guided by ethics of relationality, responsibility to care for other species, mutual respect, and reciprocity, giving and receiving. It's also highly practical and necessary work to support ecosystem health. Karuk Natural Resources Director Bill Tripp describes the application of cultural fire as a human service that benefits ecosystems, in contrast to the language we often hear about ecosystem services. Cultural burning is very diverse and varied depending on the people who are applying it, the landscape, the conditions of the landscape, and the applications include but are not limited to reducing pests and acorns and other traditional foods, stimulating the regeneration of native and culturally important plants, reducing the proliferation of invasive species, raising the water table by reducing the number of plants crowding on the landscape, and creating habitat for wildlife and improving the quality of basketry material, such as on the redbud being burned here. We have been able to have several cultural fire workshops with generous support from the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, the Yochadihi Endowed Chair in the Department of Native American Studies, and the Department of Plant Sciences. These are opportunities for collaborative restoration on the land, learning how to apply cultural burning and observing its effects. They have resulted in intertribal collaboration, in collaborations between tribes and agencies, and student and faculty growth and collaboration, as well as beneficial effects on the landscape. We had larger workshops in 2020, slightly smaller in 2021 due to COVID concerns. We meet primarily in Mariposa, hosted by the North Fork Mono Chairman Ron Good, and at the Tending and Gathering Garden, hosted by the Tending and Gathering Garden Steering Committee, which is a diverse group of indigenous weavers at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve in Woodland, California. We have diverse attendees from multiple tribes, different university departments at different universities, state and federal agencies, as well as conservation organizations and community members. In Mariposa, we focused on burning a meadow impacted by invasive plants, and then burning specific areas of culturally important plants, including sourberry, elderberry, and redbud. And we also had the wonderful opportunity to work with weavers to process basketry materials from the previous burns in 2018, 2019, and 2020, and we contributed to restoring historic trails. At the Tending and Gathering Garden, the students and I have an ongoing opportunity to visit the site and work with the plants and prepare for the burn, as well as come out after the burn and contribute to the maintenance of the site. Because it is close to campus, we're able to develop a long-term relationship with the weavers and with the area of the garden. So some outcomes we see on the land: new growth of healthy, culturally important plants, reduction in brush and downed woody debris, enhanced food and basketry materials available for weavers, which strengthen cultural perpetuation, plans for soil surveys and other monitoring of biodiversity, and we recognize and commit, as long as we are able to and invited to support the maintenance and stewardship over time of these sites, because cultural burning requires repeated care and relationship. A few hopeful directions I'll point to. One is emerging state policies. The California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan that was released in January recognizes tribes specifically as partners in developing prescribed fire plans and recommends funding specifically to support cultural burning, which is very exciting. The California Climate Assessment, the fourth assessment, contained the first tribal and indigenous chapter, and there's quite a bit of attention to cultural burning in that chapter. And Executive Order N8280, also from Governor Newsom, on biodiversity, specifically recognizes the importance of cultural burning in California. We also see increasing learning opportunities in support of Indigenous-led burning. We have a new postdoctoral fellow that will be joining us at UC Davis as part of the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and a network of postdocs at all the Climate Adaptation Science Centers across the nation focusing on fire. We are looking for support for additional intertribal collaborations, Keepers of the Flame workshops, and support for tribal agency and tribal university partnerships to forward this work. Thank you very much, and I'm honored to introduce my colleague, Dr. Helene Margolis, who is an Associate Adjunct Professor of Internal Medicine with the UC Davis School of Medicine. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in the session on sustaining your communities. I'm here to talk a little bit about the work we're doing related to climate change and the clinical and public health impacts and solutions. In particular, today I'm focusing on air pollution, wildfires, and heat, and their intersections with chronic diseases. So what does climate change have to do with chronic diseases? Well, when we speak of chronic diseases, we're talking about conditions such as overweight, obesity, what we refer to as metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, chronic kidney disease, and various neurologic disorders, as well as mental health conditions. And these diseases are increasing globally, so much so that the societal and economic costs are not sustainable. And chronic diseases are really at the eye of the storm of climate change mediated environmental changes and extreme events. Again, I'm focusing on air pollution, heat today, but there are diverse exposures that have serious consequences. And air pollution in this discussion contributes to disease onset as well as exacerbation. So an example of an exacerbation would be if you have cardiovascular disease and you're exposed to air pollution, it has the potential to increase the risk of a heart attack. So that would be an extreme exacerbation. And it also contributes, air pollution can contribute to severity of disease. And people with chronic diseases tend to be more vulnerable physiologically, but also to failures of infrastructure such as power supply that they need for medical devices or access to medications. And they're also very much more susceptible to communicable diseases as we've seen with the pandemic and the very serious adverse outcomes and mortality that people with chronic diseases succumb to the virus. There's also adverse psychosocial consequences. When people have a chronic disease, it's often very challenging for today living. And so there's mental challenges, mental health challenges as well. There's interactions of air pollution, chronic diseases, and heat. And I'm just briefly going to give you an overview of how these pieces fit together. First of all, when we talk about air pollution and we're focusing on various sources, so in much of the research that's gone on, it's focused on traffic-related air pollutants, but industrial emissions, even emissions from wildfires, can increase the risk of both air pollutants that cause or are associated with adverse health outcomes, but they're also releasing greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. And so if we could control the sources of pollution, we are both addressing health consequences and the climate crisis. So just as a few examples of how air pollution will affect human health, first of all, what's important and shown here is that it can affect people across their life course, from during pregnancy, during in utero life, to baby, to childhood, through middle age, and through older age. Not only can it contribute to disease onset, but also progression of the disease. And among the health conditions that we've associated with in this graphic, traffic-related air pollutants, but also industrial air pollutants, increased risk of metabolic syndrome, again, overweight, obesity, blood sugar challenges, hypertension, and inflammation. There's direct effects on respiratory health of air pollutants. There's direct effects on cardiovascular health. And one of the greatest risk factors for asthma in both children and adults is obesity, overweight. And there's a number of immunologic reasons for that. The other thing is that hypertension and blood sugar challenges can contribute to chronic kidney disease, and that interplays with cardiovascular disease. And really, living with a chronic disease is very challenging. And so often there are mental health challenges such as depression and anxiety just from day-to-day living with a chronic disease. And of course, natural disasters with wildfires, there's tremendous emotional challenges and traumas, and that amplifies the effects. In the context of heat and how that plays into this is that normally when we're exposed to heat, our body has these amazing thermoregulatory processes that regulates the amount of heat that's retained in our body. And so the blood circulates to the surface from the inner portion, or what we call our core, and which protects our heart and our lungs and our brain. And part of that process is to circulate blood to the surface where it gets cooled off through when we sweat. It takes the heat out of our bodies. And it depends on a healthy brain, lungs, heart, kidneys, and overall good health and adequate hydration to function optimally. But if we have challenges such as from chronic diseases and we're not functioning optimally for thermoregulation, and the heat exposure continues, it could lead to heat-related illness, including the most severe form of life-threatening heat stroke. And it can also increase the risk because we're stressing our hearts and our lungs just in this normal process. It could lead to chronic disease acute events. So what are we doing about some of these challenges? First of all, there's research and translation, and much of our research is built around this multiple determinants of health model, where essentially your health begins with an individual. So that may be a patient and their access to health care and their basic biology, their exposures, and their social economic environment. So the social determinants of health play into this in a significant way. And then individuals comprise communities. And so we can address the challenges to health both at a community level and at the individual level, as well as regionally and certainly globally. And our research focuses on clinical effects and effective interventions, seeking opportunities for population health promotion and illness prevention, increasing health systems access and sustainability, and really looking for community collaborations. Education and community engagement. I have a particular focus on educating our medical students about the clinical challenges they may face due to climate change, but there's also the education of our colleagues, clinicians, our patients, community knowledge exchange, because a community often has great information for us to act on in terms of what are the obstacles and facilitators of their health promotion practices. And of course, educating policymakers. And then we seek to using this interdisciplinary approach of synthesizing and translating information to policy, always striving for health and social equity, and really seeking processes that build social cohesion. And ultimately, this hopefully translates to social justice and earth justice, which we support advocacy measures. So thank you, and I appreciate your time, and I will glad to answer any questions. I'd like to turn the discussion over now to Dr. Jay Lund, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering, a longtime colleague, and he will share with you the work he's doing. Again, thank you very much.
California is seeing quite a lot of extensive wildfire impacts in the last few years, even beyond the kind of extensive wildfire impacts that we've had in the past. California is a region that has always had a lot of wildfires, but we've been having a lot more of them, and they've been burning more extensively and causing a lot more effects on public health, economy, and ecosystems than they have in the past. Public health impacts of wildfires are certainly local. We have had some really regrettable deaths that have occurred, both from burning directly and from air quality, as well as injuries from the local wildfires. But these public health impacts are often much greater at a regional or statewide scale due to air quality, including estimates last year of maybe up to 1,000 deaths statewide from breathing difficulties and various air quality impacts, as well as injuries from air quality to the health impaired. Economic impacts of wildfires are certainly intense locally, where the fires go after structures as well as forests. However, these economic disruptions locally are magnified and often much greater, again through the path of air quality interruptions to shutdowns of regional economies and schools and activities at the regional scale and statewide. Ecosystems also suffer from the fires and burning, both directly and longer-term habitat effects from these wildfires locally. And it's a matter of, I think, some research interest, hopefully, of are there more regional air quality effects on ecosystems at larger scales. The local impacts are much more prevalent in the media and the internet, but the regional air quality, health, and economic impacts might be much larger than the local impacts. Wildfire management portfolios exist. There's a wide range of things that we can do to manage wildfires. These fall in a couple of different categories: things that we do to reduce the frequency and extent of wildfires. You might call it wildfire protection. And things that we do to reduce the vulnerability of people, structures, and ecosystems to fires. All of these things we have to do before wildfires actually occur. We have a number of systems of wildfire detection and research, development, planning, integration, where we try to merge these kinds of activities before fires in order to make our response efforts, our management efforts, more effective. When a fire occurs, we have a set of response actions in time that need to be taken, both from early detection, inspections of fuel breaks, firefighting activities to reduce the extent and frequency of fires, as well as warning systems, emergency mobilizations, evacuations, sheltering, and then air pollution sort of masks and warnings that we do to reduce the effects, the vulnerability of populations to wildfire effects. And then finally, we have recovery actions. After a wildfire, we go back in, do our assessments, see what should we do to prepare for the next wildfire so that our responses are more effective, so that our preparatory actions are more effective, both in reducing the extent and frequency of wildfires and in reducing the vulnerability of people, populations, economies, and ecosystems to wildfire. So what should be done in terms of wildfire management? Ideally, we want to come up with the best portfolio mix of all of these different kinds of activities to reduce the local and regional impacts of wildfire. This is going to require quite a bit of analysis, quite a bit of discussion. It's going to involve making some decisions about trade-offs among local and regional impacts and costs for these management activities. It also, I think, is going to require quite a lot of multi-scale coordination between local, regional, and state governments. These are very large problems. They extend over a wide range of very heterogeneous areas and have a lot of different impacts that require a lot of folks to get involved, from landowners to governments to different interest groups. Hopefully also we develop a set of continuous improvement systems so that in response to each wildfire season, we can go back in and make improvements in our preparations and our responses and our recovery systems for each wildfire season. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all our panelists for sharing how their work is changing lives and leading our communities towards a healthier future. Let's move on to the Q&A segment. I now want to invite all our speakers to come on screen as we begin our discussion. So as Helene arrives, we had a plethora of questions submitted, so we will dive into those first, and then we will move on to the questions posted during the Q&A session. So to start, and I can see that Helene is joining in a minute, but to start, let me start with a question on drought for you, Jay. So we are in a drought unless a miracle April or May happens. So what are the fire-related dynamics that we should expect in the short term and in the long term?
Well, this is the second dry year in a row, following the previous drought and a couple of wet years after that. The basins are pretty dry. They were dry from last year. They're going to be drier this year. So I'd expect that the fire season is likely to start early this year and perhaps go late unless we get early precipitation in September. So I think things are likely to be dire, both for water supply and for fires this year.
Thank you, Jay. And Bethros, a question for you. Do you see us returning to prescribed burns to help control wildfires?
Yes, I think prescribed burn and cultural burning are essential. I would differentiate between the two, and you might hear different opinions on this. But cultural burning is very specific, guided by cultural knowledge, relationships with the landscape. Prescribed burning is different. It's a process of implementing fire without the same ethics, but similarly can have very positive effects on the landscape. And tribes are engaged in both prescribed fire and cultural burning. So definitely we need more good fire on the landscape.
We need more of those. Yes. Thank you, Petros. And then I have a question for Helene. Uh, have our recent fire events led to a rise in respiratory illness? And what are the most effective ways of limiting exposure to smoke?
Hi, thank you. So there are studies to show that there's increased incidence of asthma and acute respiratory effects in across the population, but mostly among people who already have conditions such as asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Those studies are using administrative health data, so we don't often have specific information about the patient other than the date of event and where it occurred. There are a few studies in play looking at electronic medical records. And in terms of protection, there's actually a resource, and I'll paste the links into the chat box, that have the EPA and the CDC, and actually the Air Resources Board also California Air Resources Board contributed to a document on how to protect yourself and the family and communities from exposure, including there was a related question about air filters. And so there's another link about information about how to keep your indoor air clean if you're fortunate enough to have appropriate equipment. I will add that there's concerns about some of our underserved and low income communities that don't have the luxury of those types of filters. And that's a current policy issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Those are very helpful thoughts, and we look forward for the resources you will add. And I'm looking at wonderful questions already posted in the Q&A, so we'll get to those very shortly. Andrew, the next question is for you. How long after a fire sweeps through a generally natural area is that area mostly resistant to another wildfire? Or perhaps for how long is that area potentially safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me just briefly answer. In a forest, and sort of typical mid-elevation Sierra forest, it would be sort of about 20 years before the surface fuel builds back up. So the dead parts of the plants that fall off trees mostly. Whereas in a grassland area, it might only take a few years for fuels to build back up, because generally the fire is sort of burning off the dead grasses and other plants, and then they grow quickly from seed or from resprouting. And so, and then in chaparral, so it's different for every type of ecosystem. In chaparral, it's probably closer to maybe 3 to 6, 7 years, depending how quickly the shrubs grow, before they form a continuous kind of fuel load canopy again. And just to close this, I mean, how am I answering this question? It's a great question, and it's actually pretty complicated, because the fuel is the plants, and so it's the living ecosystem and how it responds to fire. And so you need to think about basically, okay, well, how are these plants going to respond to the fire? How does the fuel build up as they grow? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I remember, so our natural reserve, the Stabbins, had a 5-year cycle. So it was burned last year, and the one was the one before that.
That's right. In 2015 and then 2020, it burned. And so that was primarily like chaparral, shrublands, and it had built up enough new growth of shrublands and resprouting oaks and other things to carry a fire really intensely again in just 5 years.
All right. Well, Andrew, the next question is also for you and then for Jay as well. So less rain means less biomass accumulation, thus less fresh fuel. But this is only for fresh fuels. So can this reflect into less fires in some areas? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's also an awesome question. It's related to the last one. So in productive grassland areas, if you have less rain, you'll have less, it's mostly exotic plants growing now, but that's what is sort of dominating a lot of these grassland ecosystems, but also goes for the native plants there, that in a really wet year, you might walk out and if it continues to rain all the way into June, the grass can sort of keep growing and get, kind of way taller than it will this year. So in a grassland area, yeah, I think it actually will have a pretty big effect. And it's the same effect you see with, both wildlife and then, ranch animals, or, there's a lot less forage this year because of less rain. In a forest or shrubland ecosystem, the effect of this year's rain would be primarily to dry the fuel out and make it more likely to burn more intensely.
Right. Thank you. And Jay, would you like to add to
I
that?
think he had a more complete answer than I can provide.
Okay, then I have the next question for you, Jay. So while the short-term effect of drought might be less fresh fuel but drier stock, how long following a drought would we typically expect a bigger long-term damage to the forest, particularly in terms of tree deaths?
There again, I think Andrew probably has a better understanding of tree deaths and forest health with drought than I do. So let me give him an opportunity to answer this one before I mangle it.
Okay.
Jay, you're putting me on the spot. Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, actually, one of the fascinating things about that really intense drought that we had starting in 2012 and then kind of in most places ending sometime in 2016 or 2017 is the kind of inertia that drought has. Like it takes a long time for the trees to start really dying en masse. It didn't really happen in most places till 2015. And then it continued and sort of spilled over, as this question suggests, into 2016 and even beyond. And so there's a bunch of reasons for that, including, some of which I know, including like groundwater, deep groundwater that the trees are accessing responds really slowly. And Majdi, you could probably correct me, or Jay could correct me on this, but right, the really deep groundwater and down into the aquifer itself that trees may be tapping, that really responds gradually over several years to drought. So a year of drought won't affect the really deep soil moisture that much, but 4 years of drought really will. And then it also has to do with, this is something that to me, honestly was a surprise researching this, was how important it was how many bark beetles there are around. I mean, maybe you think this is obvious, but I was really thinking of it more from a tree side view, like the trees are getting thirstier and thirstier, and then finally they're, dying. But it's also that the populations of bark beetles are building up over a couple of years. And then once you get enough of them, they're able to attack more trees. So kind of those things. And then the bark beetles persist. It's that the population doesn't immediately go down when the drought ends. And so they can kind of continue. And the trees don't immediately sort of spring back and like build their reserves of food back up immediately. It takes a couple of years. So anyway, often it's like the end of a multi-year drought and then the next couple of years where the trees are mostly dying.
It is
I think that's a really important aspect to point to. The last drought was 2012 to 2016, and then 2017 we had a tremendous water year. But the trees continued to die, and then the wildfires came. And if you looked at the total cost of that 5-year drought, it was about $9 billion statewide over the 5 years. Well, I don't know if you remember, but in the next few years, we had several $10 or $15 billion fires just for property damage, plus the additional air pollution. So in essence, the most of the drought impacts were from wildfires, and they happened after the drought had ended.
Yep.
I found that very sobering when I did those calculations.
Indeed. Thank you, Jay. Helene, we're back to health. And the question for you is how to prepare senior communities to recognize wildfire threats. And evacuate safely and in a timely fashion?
So that's a huge question, and it's really an important one. And I don't know that we have all the answers because Paradise had an amazing plan in place for a wildfire, and yet it just the fire was so unpredictable. All I can say is that there are models. Paradise had one, but I think what they learned, and a key aspect of it was evacuation routes, and that with the current wildfire regimes, we cannot necessarily predict their behaviors. So there have to be multiple options for escape in terms of older adults and who are especially on medical devices. It's really important. And fortunately, the technology for battery backup is improving. So one of the things to also have are battery backup for devices. So there's a number of efforts in place now, actually thinking about how best to do that. But as far as I know, and I've looked fairly recently, there is no really clear guidance yet. A lot of it is really common sense, but I think the most important thing is that even for communities like Paradise that had a plan in place, expect the unexpected. So really think about all contingencies.
Yeah, thank you, Helene. And Beth Rose, is there a benefit to have planned managed burns versus out of control wildfire? I would like to start with you and also hear from Andrew on this question.
Definitely, I think we can all agree on that. Last week, I was on a webinar with the Southwest Adaptation Forum with Margot Robbins from the Cultural Fire Management Council, and she posed a very powerful question at the end, which was, what kind of smoke would you like? Would you like toxic smoke from catastrophic fire, or would you like a lower level of smoke from prescribed burning to keep the landscape healthy and to reduce the risk of catastrophic fire? So I absolutely am in support of some prescribed managed burning. I think it will help reduce the risk of catastrophic fire.
And Andrew, would you like
Oh
to
yeah,
add?
sorry. Yeah, that I completely agree. It's a fantastic answer, and yeah, it's a challenge sometimes to implement cultural burning and prescribed burning because of air quality concerns. But I think it's, that's an area where things are moving in a really good direction. I think there's starting to be more flexibility and appreciation for what Beth Rose just said.
All right. And I'm going to take one more question from the questions that were sent earlier, and I will move to the live questions in the Q&A because there are so many awesome questions asked live by the attendees today. So this is a question to the panel. What data sources are being used by UC Davis that may be available to agencies in planning for wildland fire risks? And given the transdisciplinary and diverse perspective of our panel, I would like to hear from all of you because there are different and a wide range of data sets that are useful. Let's start with Andrew, for example.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, one thing that we have been building up at UC Davis is a set of a bunch of through many years of different kinds of post-fire, pre-fire and post-fire ecological monitoring of different forests. We have a pretty good data set on, one of the earlier questions was how quickly do fuels build up after fire, different kinds of fire or different types of fuels treatments, such as like mechanical thinning versus prescribed fire versus other options. And so even though that's in, each of those data points is one particular location, if you build this up over most of the Sierras and even into the San Bernardinos in Southern California and Klamath and Northern California, it starts to provide a pretty useful picture, I think, about the fuel dynamics. So that's something we're hoping will be useful.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Helene, any health data sets that you would like to direct us for?
So in terms of the health data, they're a challenge because most of them are confidential. There are some public use health data that are administrative that the state has at the California Department of Public Health Office of Statewide Health Planning. And those, they're not spatially resolved, but they have some temporal data on like asthma cases. And it takes a bit of skill to work with them, but those are available publicly. And then there's, unfortunately, a lot of these conditions are not reportable. So there are not like a data set with just asthma cases or just heart attacks that you can link up, but there are public use data sets. I personally have access to, and it takes a lot of permissions to use the confidential data files in both like electronic medical records and the state administrative data.
Thank you, Helene. And Jay, maybe some also insights from your end. What data layers is the Center for Watershed Sciences is using, and we can use?
Well, we work much less on health data, but we tend to look more at the agricultural and energy and water supply impacts. And so we sort of scour the earth for those kinds of data as they come available during a drought.
Thank you, Jay. And as we continue with our Q&A for the next 15 minutes, you should see a poll on your screen. Please take a minute to answer the question. We'd really love to have your feedback. And back to our questions. Andrew, in the Q&A, I see a question at the beginning on invasive species, like Spanish moss, for example, and what threats do they pose to the oak woodlands being replanted in areas affected by the recent wildfires?
Yeah, that's a great question because, I mean, in general, there are many invasive plants that do change the way fire behaves, and also could weaken trees to make them more susceptible to fire. In this case, though, these are plants that we wouldn't, well, there's native mistletoe plants that, so part of the question, and this, maybe I can kick some of this over to Beth Rose, but some of the pests or plants and beetles that affect oaks and weaken them and make them more susceptible to fire or just simply dying can be reduced by cultural burning or other forms of fire. And so, yeah, the mistletoes are actually, they're part of the native flora here, but they can become a problem if you've got, for example, trees growing too long without fire or maybe too densely.
All right, thanks, Andrew. The next question is for Beth Rose. So given the increased building in wilderness, do you see a near-term future for practical and more broad applications of indigenous burning methods by state and local groups for land management? Is this even reasonable for us to hope for?
Yes, definitely. And I think that question may speak to perhaps uneven participation or ability to participate in local planning by tribes, recognized or unrecognized. I think this varies widely across California because with tribal participation, that might lead to protection or setting aside areas that are ecologically and culturally important. I would say I think that cultural burning is a particularly important tool because it can be applied either broadly or very specifically to smaller areas. So could perhaps, depending on collaborations with tribes and native nonprofits and families, it could perhaps be used in smaller areas, even in neighborhoods, to reduce fire danger. I think, though, it speaks to a broader issue of building and land management decisions being made within tribal homelands without necessarily tribal participation. So the cultural burning, I think, is about more than the ecological impact, but also about the recognition and access and stewardship led by Indigenous peoples. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Beth Rose. And the next question is also a follow-up. Are there any challenges to cultural burns, and how are these challenges being mitigated?
Yes, there are many challenges. One has to do with being able to acquire burn permits. Sometimes there's no category. There isn't no category necessarily for cultural burning. Some people have had to use agricultural burning permits or other types of categories for cultural burning, which is different than that type of burning. There's another issue with training and certification. Many of the people that we are lucky to work with, such as Chairman Good and others, have extensive multi-generational knowledge of how to apply fire, and we've seen that enacted, but they may or may not have the certifications, the Burn Boss certification required to be able to implement fire, which can also be a barrier. And I think there are creative collaborations, and also it depends on the type of land jurisdiction you're working on, that are working to address these issues.
Thank you, Beth Rose. Andrew, how can we best remove the millions of dead trees in the Sierras? Don't they present a major threat?
Okay, yeah, well, it's undeniable that there's been a big change, right? More than 100 million trees killed over a couple of year period, so much more than usual. So it's a little bit complicated because there's some places where they clearly are going to be and need to be removed, and that would be like where they're dead trees or snags are posing hazards to roads or some trails. And another is often when there's an area that is kind of a high priority replanting area. Often it's works, basically there's certain forestry practices are a lot easier if you remove the dead trees first and then plant new ones. On the other hand, I mean, having a lot of snags, dead trees around is really important for some of the species that exist in this ecosystem. So maintaining some of the areas, we don't have a shortage right now, but kind of like carefully thinking about, well, let's keep some of the areas unsalvage logged because they provide that sort of service. Or, they're the home for things like black-backed woodpeckers. And also kind of can help protect the soil and even nurture sometimes seedlings. You see them sometimes growing out from under fallen logs. Falling logs can create gaps in the shrubs that allow trees to get going. So it's a mixed bag. The thing I didn't address so far is what's the importance of those as a fuel? Is that a problem when future fires come through? And that's actually a really important and active area of research because the answer is not obvious. You might think it is, but it's big logs don't tend to burn up in a wildfire most of the time, but they can potentially contribute. If you've got large logs lying around over very large areas, they could potentially, it looks like, contribute to kinds of really active, fast-moving fire behavior. But that's really uncertain, so that I have a hard time answering it.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And another question is lined up for you here. So is the bark beetle continuing to spread in the Sierras, or did it slow over the past few years? Curious about replanting burned ponderosa pine areas with more resistant pine species.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, it is so the bark beetles are around. They're also native species, and they tend to exist in kind of small numbers. And then there's a weak tree. They can get together using pheromones to attract each other to the tree and kill it, and often make little patches of dead trees or individual trees. So that's what's been going on since sort of the aftermath of the drought has been over. So they've reverted to kind of their more normal role of, culling out certain trees from the forest. And replanting, yeah, I think it's really important to not just plant a single species of tree that's susceptible to a particular bark beetle host, because it's like putting out a buffet for them. So we don't want to eliminate ponderosa pines because they're vulnerable, but mix them up with other trees that can also grow.
Yeah. And I can see a question from one of your former students. So your and Beth Rose's. So hello, Professors Latimer and Middleton. I was your student a while back. Besides this presentation, I'm curious if you have ever worked together for collaborative fire restoration practices. So we're pushing for more collaboration here.
Nice to see you or hear your question, Marcel. I think that we would love to explore collaborations. I think there are lots of important directions we can go, and that's one of the things I do really appreciate about UC Davis is a lot of opportunity for interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, thanks, Maricel. That's fantastic. Yeah, I was happy that Beth Rose reached out to me recently, and we started talking about potentially advising a student looking at cultural burning in some coast range areas. So yeah, definitely more to come, I guess.
All right. Thank you. And this is a question on rural communities. Should small rural communities remove downed oak trees and scrub brush in the perimeter of homes and buildings? So more of defensible space type of question. Maybe Andrew and Beth Rose, who would like to start on this? Andrew?
Well, okay, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, one thing is, shortest answer probably yes, because having a bunch of dead fuel under the edge of your house is probably not, it'll make your house more vulnerable if a fire comes through. There is some interesting research recently that's been showing that kind of clearing the fuels from right around your house, the defensible space, it's important, but it's maybe not as important as kind of the building materials of the house or whether the eaves are sealed to embers, because a lot of the ways that fire gets into communities like Paradise is through the fire tossing embers and burning bits. And so even if your house were well cleared around it, if some flaming thing gets into your attic, then it'll start a fire.
Yeah. And Beth Rose, would you like to add anything on this with also some of the practices? Please go ahead.
Oh, I don't think I have anything to add. Andrew's answer was great. Thank you.
All right. So what is your top recommendation for counties to reduce the risk of wildfires? Again, action-based type of a question, and I would like to open it for the entire panel, see what thoughts everyone have on this. Jay, any thoughts?
Well, the county governments are certainly the ones that are right on the ground up in the forests, but they're often not very rich forms of government. They're not rich governments. Their resources are usually very, very much stretched. Any assistance they can get from the tribes or from other groups, the state agencies, federal agencies involved, I think and the private industry are probably quite important for managing the fuels up in the watershed. Well, I see it as a watershed. Other people here see it as forests.
Yeah.
Might add, I see promising work coming from fire safe councils, bringing together citizens groups to learn more about the application of fire and implementing either prescribed fire primarily, and also partnerships across jurisdictions and all landscape approach, I think is very important.
All right, and I have a question from my Paradisian friend, Susan. So managing fire in the forests is one thing. Managing fire in the wildland-urban interface is quite another. What kinds of wisdom and training could be passed on to people living in the wildland-urban interface areas to protect themselves, not only through prevention, but when fire comes through, as it inevitably will?
I think county building codes are going to be pretty important here, as well as Helene pointed out, having multiple means of escape and refuge. That's been very important for other kinds of disasters. How do you keep people safe even if their structures go away? How do you keep enough structures in the community that are safe so that people can take refuge there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anyone who would like to add anything to this question?
No, I think that's also what jumped up to me is your safety and planning kinds of things, being ready,
Yeah.
knowing what you're going to do.
That's, I was going to say the same, following on that, is that families, it's really important that families have an emergency response plan. And FEMA and other, the California Office of Emergency Services have nice little packages of how to do that planning. And they come up with some things that, might not be at the top of the list that we come up with. So I highly recommend that families and children as young as 4 and 5 are able to deal with this type of information. So really it's a family project, and it helps with any kind of disaster, but especially with fires.
Thank you, Helene. And there's a question for you on COVID, in fact. So could long haul COVID disease be another pulmonary issue to be concerned with?
Absolutely. And in fact, I and a colleague, we have one of the only in the nation long COVID clinics at UC Davis Health. And a colleague and I are actually developing, hopefully will be funded, a project to actually look at the impacts of wildfire, smoke, and as well as some other environmental exposures, both in terms of precipitating long COVID. So if you have an active SARS-CoV-2 infection, whether that co-exposure can increase the risk of long COVID, but then also for patients who have long COVID, they certainly need to, especially if it's manifesting as a respiratory condition, they definitely need to speak to their physician and how best to protect themselves. N95 masks work, but you need to make sure they're an appropriate precaution for you if you're already having respiratory stress. So it is a serious problem, potential problem.
All right. Thank you, Helene. And there are so many awesome questions, which unfortunately we won't be able to ask them all. One last question for you, Jay. Historically, do we know much about how bad previous droughts were and how this one compares? How much of this drought is typical?
If you go back to the Paleo record, back in the Middle Ages, there were several droughts in Southern California, up into the southern foothills, I think, that lasted for 150 or 200 years. Enough so that some of the lakes that drain into the rivers in the Sierra Nevada went dry. Didn't go dry, but they were closed off. They went below their rims for long enough to grow 40 or 50-year-old trees. So we've had very long droughts in California, much longer than what we've seen. California always has a lot of variability in hydrology. We have more flood years and drought years per average year than any other part of the country. Climate change is going to make it more so.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay, and thank you for all your thoughtful questions. It has been really wonderful to see your engagement and have such a thoughtful discussion. And with this, I would like to thank all our panelists for sharing their time and insights on how UC Davis is leading the charge in making the world a better place by taking bold ideas and creating daring and innovative solutions. Each and every one of them represent UC Davis's commitment to outgrowing the expected, to challenge the status quo, and to find new ways to help those who need it most. Wherever your passion may be, there is a way that you can help support it. If you are interested in giving to any of the research and programs discussed today by our panelists, or to support another area, you can reach or contact Ashley Green. And I'd also like to thank you all for joining us today and for your philanthropic support. I hope you will be able to join us tomorrow at noon for the conclusion of our Part 2 Sustaining Healthier Community event series, focusing on building circular economies while fighting fire. We hope you all stay healthy and safe, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Goodbye and thank you.